Okay, so this is the video where I'm going to walk you through how to map out and plan ahead for how you will begin carving into your bar of soap, because it will be important to sort of know what you need to save as a material and what you need to carve away. So there are a couple different ways you can get started in terms of mapping and measuring. So just for example, on this particular one that I showed you an example of carving, how I started this was just by literally taking this and laying it on top of the bar of soap and sort of lining this up to the bottom of the piece, and then making sure my tool was straight up and down as opposed to at an angle, right? An angle out or an angle in is going to change that direction. But if I'm straight up and down, I get a pretty accurate measurement. Okay, now this is pretty subtle, but I could go back in and make those lines a little more defined. But now I know that's kind of like my general starting place. If I were to cut away all of this material, then I would be able to start rounding out shapes and shifting planes. The other thing that you can do then is reference this from above. So I would also remind myself then that this angle here just subtly turns in, and this angle here subtly turns in. And as I'm carving away, I can kind of pay attention to that angle. I can even kind of draw this line from the front to the side, because that is my reference where I shift from the sort of body or the volume of the nail polish to the top half. So a lot of this is just kind of mapping and plotting and transferring marks from the front to the back, etc. Okay, so that was how this piece initially started, was just by marking out and laying the shape over it. But I'm going to try to make this little tube here, and that I kind of had mentioned it before, that one of the cool things about this is that it's got a little flexibility in how I shape it, so that I can work to kind of fit it onto the surface here, and maybe making sure that I can get the angle of this to fit on to here. So the first thing that I'm still going to do here is trace this from the top it's okay to trace it a little bit bigger than it actually is, and that actually would be better than if you made it a little too small. Remember, when you're removing material, you can always remove more material, but you can't add that material back. That's part of the reductive soap carving process. So give yourself that extra little space to kind of work with. So I'm going to start cutting away at that, and only focusing on the top shape first before I switch to the side and worry about those angles. I can do this a couple different ways, so it's kind of tempting to just try to cut straight through the soap all the way across. And maybe if you have a long enough knife, that's kind of okay. But I prefer, just so I don't take off too much, to either, use a butter knife or a dull X-Acto knife. This tool is still fairly sharp, but not quite as sharp as an X-Acto knife. So that could work good for whittling away, or even, as I had talked about before, this clay loop tool can work really good And as I get closer to where some of the more fine details are, I'm going to slow myself down a little bit. And my goal, just with this particular shape, is as I'm shaving away these sides, I'm trying to keep it straight up and down, as opposed to undercut one way or sort of flaring out the other way. I just want to go straight up and down, remove that material, then I'll turn it, and then I'll start shaping it and kind of really giving the form a little bit more life. But if I'm not paying attention and I undercut this too much, meaning I take more of this material away, then when I go to carve, I'm going to realize I have as much material as I need at the top, but not at the underside. Don't forget to reference back to your original form every once in a while. I think one of the things that I'm going to do is really observe what's happening here at this point. Now starting to think about that angle and how much material that I might need. And then also where that cap is in relation to the rest of the form. Just so as I decide, like, is this line actually the line that I can draw from the front to the back? Accurate? How much wiggle room do I have? And this is shorter than what I actually need, but the idea is that it's going to be angled on this, and so I'll get a little more length with it because of that. So it can be helpful to continue to measure these things along the way. So reductive carving and thinking about carving representational objects is very much like drawing a still life, where you should be referencing the original form quite often, as opposed to just sort of letting your brain go into shortcut mode and just think like, yeah, I get the general idea, I know what it looks like. Because oftentimes the like shortcut that our brain makes about what we think something looks like is the sort of very cartoony version of it. We just need to get a understanding of what it is in front of us as quickly as we can. And so we don't always, just on our sort of day-to-day existence, really notice the little nuances that are happening within the objects that we encounter. So that's one of the things that I really love about art, about sculpture, about sort of observational work, is that it forces us to sort of slow down and pay attention to things that we might not normally pay attention to. So before I get too far, I am starting to kind of trace this form and find out where the angles are, where I may need to scoop some things away. So I don't know how well you can see that, but that's really thin right there. And so I'm actually going to kind of bulk that up a little bit. Okay, and as I start to carve, I'm going to be, and remove material, I'm going to be slow and gentle. Try to just take little bits off at a time as opposed to big chunks. That's also usually when people get in trouble, is if you try to take off too much at once. I also hear students say a lot that they're afraid that they're going to break the soap. it's good to be observant and kind of aware of your pressure and you know what you are working on, but there's really nothing to be afraid of. It's just soap. And if it breaks, then that's your opportunity to learn. And you know, if you did it once, you can do it again, and you can probably do it faster and a little bit better the next time around. But you know, the cool thing about working with soap is that if the soap breaks, it's still soap. And you haven't really lost too much, except for maybe a little bit of time. But that time also wasn't wasted time. That was an opportunity to work with your hands, work with the tools, and learn about the materials. So even sort of what we tend to think of as failures, something that broke, still teaches us a lot. So don't be afraid of your soap. Okay, so now I'm kind of scooping out a little of this area here. I want this kind of sweeping angle. So this process here is essentially what I've been doing for like the last 15 minutes here is blocking out my form. So I am trying to figure out where those general shapes go. I'm not thinking about the fine little details yet. I'm really thinking about the big picture, about removing kind of the bulk of the material before I get into any of that detail work. It can be easy to get really obsessed with one thing, but try to think more about the big picture than just that one little detail. So the other thing that I can pay attention to is that the top of this is sort of oval and round, and I'm still kind of working with a more of a square / rectangle here. So that's another thing that I can start focusing on is sort of rounding these edges before I get too far into detail work. So I can kind of knock off those corners. So that's another interesting thing to kind of pay attention to, something that makes this shape a little bit more unique if I want to kind of highlight it, is that diagonal that's present right there. And again, I said I'm not going to like scoop that out really as thin as it actually is, but I can give it just a little bit of that. I'm going to start rounding some of these edges out a little bit. Get a little thinner here. Whoops, I got a really thin there, so I went a little too far. But I don't want to take everything too thin here because I still have a lot of work to do up top. And so sometimes I strategize, kind of thinking about where I should leave a little bit more mass until I start getting into my detail work, just so that I don't have super fragile little ends that I'm working with. So I'm looking at planes, the way that sort of a shape comes straight down and then curves out and then maybe rounds, or kind of hides a little fold. So I also go from noticing kind of the big picture when I'm blocking out the form to noticing some of those finer little details that really can give the illusion of this being not just a solid mass, right? It's soap and it's soft, but it's still a solid mass. It doesn't have the same flexibility that this does. But if I continue to kind of work and pay attention to shifting some of these planes, making some a little bit more flat, some a little more angled, some having that little curve or pucker, this can start to feel like an actual sort of tube of paint or ointment or whatever it happens to be. And that's one of the really cool things about observation and really paying attention to those details. It's like, what are the things that make it come to life? And how can I trick the viewer into believing this? In these pieces, I'm thinking about having you work representationally. So we're really trying to get as realistic of a representation of the work as possible. But, you know, sometimes there's also a fun place in that middle ground when things seem recognizable, but kind of are a little bit more playful, a little bit more messy. They don't kind of fit neatly into the categories we want them to fit into. You can make the viewer work a little bit harder to really see what it is that you were trying to make or communicate. This is just like a super cheap little tool that I stole from my daughter from like a little Play-Doh toolkit. I like it because it's got the serrated edge teeth on it. You can also usually find butter knives with that same kind of texture on them. Helps me to remove material while kind of maintaining, I mean, even though it's textured, maintaining a bit of a flat plane. If I were to just try to take a tool and cut straight through this, chances are my tool would not follow the direct path that I wanted it to follow. So shaving things away with a serrated edge, something with a little tooth to it, is a good trick. I also have mentioned these ribs that have the serrated edge teeth. So one side here is higher. Can you see that? How do I line that up? This side here is a little higher and this side is a little lower. So the only thing to do, I can't add to this, so I'm going to have to subtract. I'm going to have to take away. And I think that will be okay. But that's what I'm going to do before I go too far. So when I'm looking at this, I can visually see that this is still much larger than this one is. There are tools that are called calipers. I think I actually have a pair. Let me grab them. Okay. Where you can measure the diameter of one thing in relation to the other. And that can kind of help you gauge whether you know, how much more you need to shave away, or, you know, actually I could measure this width here and then compare it, and I could see, oh, I have a lot of tapering to do on this shape in order to get it sort of more narrow and round. I'm kind of making mine oval, but it's actually round. So the more that I work and then I start paying attention to those things, the more refined I get. But the other thing, if you don't have, you know, a caliper, you could use, trying to think of something you can see better, but I can hold this tool up to the edge and kind of put my other two fingers on the opposite edge and then measure that and then hold it up and compare it to this and just kind of give myself that visual of how much more I'll need to trim off. It's a lot easier for me to see those relationships in person, but that's kind of the general idea, is you can just, if you don't have the calipers, now the other thing I know is that even though I'm tapering this in because it's more round, that doesn't mean that that shape doesn't still come down and out at a bit of an angle. So I'm tapering this in, but I'm still maintaining a bit of that edge. Ooh, I got really close to chipping too much off. So as I start to get smaller, I want to start slowing myself down, being a little more cautious of those edges. So what if something were to break and you were like super close to the end and you just could not, you just didn't have it in you to finish it? I might suggest just leaving that break as a visible part and making everything else sort of as detailed as you can, just kind of to finish and follow through on the exercise. You know, and sometimes it's interesting to think about that break. There's a lot of historical references to figures that have missing limbs, missing heads, missing hands, and we still find them really compelling. Maybe that's just telling a new story. Mom? So I have a visitor, and the great thing about reductive carving is that you can pause it and take a break and come back to it when you have time. Okay, I'm back and I have an assistant here working on a carving as well. So this is about the time also when I've decided I'm needing to slow down a lot more and make kind of smaller, more refined moves, be a little bit more careful with my tools. I've also realized that I got distracted by my new assistant and carved a little bit too much away from the top of the tube, and ultimately, I decided that I would just pretend that I had taken the cap off of the tube, and that was why it was smaller. So I figured out a clever way to get around something that didn't quite work out. Don't forget, you can use a soft brush to wipe away any shavings that you need. Continue to compare the original object with the object you're carving along the way.
That's really good.
Thanks. It's never a bad idea for someone to give you a pep talk along the way. You can even give yourself some compliments. So if you've noticed, I've switched to a serrated edge tool again, and I'm really working to thin out the tube and kind of define some of the nuances of the form a little bit more. And then because it had the serrated edge teeth, I'm coming back with another tool that's just that metal hook tool or a loop tool, and sort of removing the teeth or the tooth that I added. And really a lot of this refining work and detail work could be done with this loop tool, if that's kind of all you had was the basic clay tool set. I'm now going to work on adding some of those extra little details. So this is the base of the tube where it's kind of been heat sealed together. And as I sped through this demo, I've kind of been whittling away. And because there's not a lot of material there, I need to go kind of pretty slow and careful with how I'm shaving that material away. So again, you can see the loop tool with the kind of squared end is working really good for kind of lowering that plane. So I can create a little bit of a difference in where light and shadow are hitting to define each of those edges. And sometimes I even start working with my nails of my fingertips. I did a lot of that sort of towards the end.
I would use this.
Because I can, sort of really feel the pressure through my fingertips rather than what I'm doing through a tool.
I would use this to get through.
You could try it, see if you like it.
I would use this to get through.
It might work for you, it might not. I know that some of you in your responses to your first posting also suggested water as a tool, and you certainly can apply just a very small amount of water to these if you really wanted to kind of smooth things out. On the bottom, I tested a tool to kind of carve in the texture, being very careful not to punch all the way through. I tried to do the same thing on the top. The needle tool was too thin, so I tried a slightly thicker tool, and that turned out to just sort of eat and chew away at it, which made it even smaller than I started out with. But as I had mentioned before, I've decided I was going to, pretend like I was carving it without the top on, and that makes it proportionally a little better. And I've kind of decided just to not fuss too much more with those rings around, or I should say the threads, because I kind of failed last time. Here I'm trying to poke a hole in the top to make it open, and I kind of know that I'm pushing it a little bit, and ultimately I did end up breaking that. So there's not really much to do to kind of try to glue it back together, and I'm just going to cut it off, make the tip a little shorter. I've got a little wiggle room. And then finally, just for that added little detail, I've decided I'll carve the top of the tube. That added little detail might be the thing that makes you believe I actually intended to do it all along. So just because this would be easy to carve again, I tried hollowing out the inside of the lid just to make it look a little more realistic. I did actually end up chipping some of the edges and had to cut that a little bit shorter as well, but it seemed like it all was proportionally just fine. But again, that was such a small piece that I wouldn't mind if I had to recarve it. And here's the finished work. Just pretend that that cap can go on top. It adds that extra little detail. So I hope you have fun with this project and found this tutorial useful. Slow and steady is the name of the game here. Have fun.